skis with The Novel Neighbor, an independently owned and operated bookstore located in Webster Groves, Missouri. Our event today is a part of the St. Louis Teen Book Festival, sponsored by the St. Louis County Library, HEC Media, and The Novel Neighbor. We are hosting over 38 of the hottest young adult writers. The St. Louis Teen Fest is 11 days of programming dedicated to connecting teen readers with a diverse group of popular writers. You can order all of our authors' books from The Novel Neighbor at thenovelneighbor.com. And we do have some special discounts if you're purchasing a bundle, so make sure to check that out. Today's panel is all about vampires never get old. And I am joined by four amazing authors, Zoraida Cordova, Natalie C. Parker, Mark Oshiro, and Laura Ruby. Our authors are all part of the incredible anthology, Vampires Never Get Old, which features short stories, as well as some follow-ups after each story. This was curated by Zoraida and Natalie. So I thought we would start by talking about the anthology as a whole, because I know there's a wonderful reason behind its creation. And so could you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Natalie, how did we create this?
How indeed. The origin story behind this is both like important and funny because we were on a writing retreat and we were floating in a pool and Zoraida just randomly said, "You know what I miss? Vampires." And it was just this moment where she and I looked at each other and were like, you know what we can bring back? Vampires. And so we started talking about what it would look like, what new vampires might look like, because of course we all read and adored the Twilight novels when they came out. But, society changes, literature changes, and that's part of the exciting thing about it. And so we discussed what would a new kind of vampire look like?
Right. And I think that wanting it to be a little bit unexpected, right? I think that when you look at young adult authors, you think, okay, these are genre authors, right? People who write like weird stuff and magic, but what about the people who write contemporary and how would they fit? Like, would you expect Julie Murphy to write a vampire story, right? And so we sort of went along that train of thought as well. And it's actually come together. It came together so seamlessly. And we are so proud of all of the stories that we have.
Yeah, what we wanted to do was create space for a wide variety of vampire stories and a wide variety of interpretations, like Zoraida was saying, from people you might not expect. I actually think Mark and Laura both fit into that category of you wouldn't have looked at the books that they have written and necessarily assumed, what they're going to write next is a vampire.
Yeah.
And that was one of the really exciting things about it is like, we really didn't know what we were going to get. And it was like a series of wonderful surprises from all of these authors.
Absolutely.
So I have a very interesting and kind of funny story about the story that I ended up submitting to this anthology. When Zoraida asked me, it was interesting because I was immediately like, I don't have a vampire story. Like, what am I doing? Like, I don't have one ready, because at that point, my second book, Each of Us in the Desert, wasn't out, so I hadn't published in the fantasy or speculative fiction genres. My first book was contemporary. But I was like, it's an interesting idea. I want to do this for my friend. Yeah, of course. Let's figure something out. So one of the things I always do if I don't immediately have an idea is I go back through old drafts of things I've written. And I found this story I wrote over a decade ago called Invisible, about this boy who was literally invisible. And it was this like high literary metaphor for like trying to comment on this concept of representation, of like what happens when you don't see yourself in the media, in the world, except this kid literally could not see themselves. And I thought I was so clever, and but it just never worked. I could never make the story work. There was always something missing. And I read it again and I was like, I like some of the words, but what is missing? And I just was like, oh my God, it's vampires.
Vampire.
A vampire. He's a vampire. Oh my God. And I took this story that was a decade old, rewrote the whole thing as this epistolary story of this kid who has a faux Tumblr blog that is sort of documenting like, hey, this is what my life is like. And then the things that happen that make him question who he is and what he's been told about vampire lore himself. And so that's how, you know, my story in here mirrors windows and selfies. That's how it came to be. I'm really proud of it. We went through, it was also really fun too, because that first round of developmental stuff where both Natalie and Zoraida were like, hey, this thing that you mentioned once is really interesting. And now you've sort of revealed, like, I feel like there's a hole. How can you fill this? How can you twist vampire mythology? And so that is where we developed, you know, how do reflections work in this world? And is a reflection a good thing? Or is that actually something that isn't real and people just believe it's a thing, that vampires can't see their reflection? And it became this whole like emotional centerpiece of the story. Yeah, so I'm really proud of it. It's just this weird kind of sad little story with a ridiculously Mark Oshiro happy ending. Because it's like, I feel like it's a happy ending, but it's also like, what's wrong with you? Like, I just like that kind of happy ending where someone's like, oh, who hurt you? But also this is a happy ending, you know?
Definitely, you know, what both Natalie and Zoraida were saying about, you know, authors being sort of unexpected in this anthology. It never occurred to me that I would ever write a vampire story, ever. You know, I love monsters, writing about monsters, thinking about the monstrous. Ghost stories tend to be where I land in terms of like monsters or in magic or whatever. But vampires, possibly because, you know, I'm sort of steeped in like Bram Stoker sort of stuff, always struck me as sort of ridiculous, you know, and like, you're not sexy. You know, I just like, I'm not into you. I just, but when they asked if I would try, I was in a really weird sort of emotional place. And I was thinking a lot about power and who gets it and who uses it. And also, again, who is considered monstrous. This was also, you know, a very specific moment in time, you know, when they asked, and I'm not sure which particular year it was, but it was it 2018?
I think it must have been 2018.
Yeah. Yes.
So I was thinking a lot about, you know, people who were being deported, and I was thinking a lot about, you know, who was just recently confirmed to the Supreme Court, and why, and you know, who was going to, you know, the kind of person who is given the power to make decisions that would impact so many people that they already considered monstrous. You know, I'm like, well, what are they gonna, and so a lot of this was going through my head, and I thought, well, what could I do with this, which is where I came up with Bestiary, which is my story, which is, it's pulling a lot of influences, including the story of Judith and Holofernes, you know, and the work of Artemisia Gentileschi, whose depiction of Judith, like chopping off the would-be rapist's head, is so visceral and wonderful. And I kind of launched from there, and was thinking about, you know, what happens when somebody who's grief-stricken, really grief-stricken, and sort of frozen in that grief, you know, at what they've become, recognizes they can use their own monstrousness,
right?
Perhaps enact justice for people. And I was interested in that. And then I do what I always do, which is like, well, there's going to be lots of animals because I love them. Because, you know, in terms of just like thinking about vampires who feed on humans, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would think that vampires would have a link towards animals, like not just the bat or maybe the cat, but also other animals, because they exist in this sort of very primal, you know, structure, like, you know, animals eat other animals. So I thought that could be really interesting. So I set it at a zoo, which I thought would be sort of amazing. And I did a more sort of near future story, because I was trying
Yes.
to anticipate, like, what would happen, you know, like if we let the people who are in power continue to be in power, what would our world look like? And I think our world would be drained. It's
And
already drained.
I think that, yeah, like your story has something like water rations. And I'm
Yeah.
like, that's not actually near future. It's now.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
that's a very, very interesting thing to look at, especially I feel like, you know, the anthology in itself is this collection of, oh, vampires, you know, mythology, so much fun, darkness, societal comments about society. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Queerness, like all of this stuff, how race impact the vampire tree line in Danielle Clayton's story. And so, yeah, I think that it's on the surface, it is this like fun thing. The cover is pink, and then when you get deeper down, you have stories like that are social commentaries, because that's what vampires are. They are a commentary about power and structure and society.
Well, and Zoraida and Natalie, what was that like? I mean, you kind of addressed this earlier. You were sent out and asked people that you thought would not be, you know, and Laura, Mark, you spoke to this, being like, okay, I'm going to write about vampires. Let's go. What was it like to receive them back? And some thoughts about how you compiled them, because you do so seamlessly. And at the end of every short story, you all have a follow-up that also asks a reflection back on us. Like as the reader, I'm asked to reflect on that story and like a common theme that came from it and how that might impact me. So how did you put all that together? I guess that's a two-part question. How did you put all that together? But also like, what was it like to receive these stories back after not knowing what you were going to get?
I was delighted every time we got a story. I was like, oh, they did this and they did that. Julie Murphy wrote a fat vampire slayer. You know, Victoria Schwab wrote a queer Buffy angel. You know, and so that was a lot of fun. I don't know about you, Natalie. Was it fun for you?
It was immensely fun. I think what was really cool and maybe like surprising, but also not surprising about it is how many of these stories were analyzing vampire mythology from that starting point of power and consent and who has these things. So while on the surface we have this mythology that has been pretty playful for most of our lives and in our culture, certainly, that in this collection took a much more intellectual and philosophical dive. But I think specifically for young adults, specifically for people who are coming into their own power, who are starting to look at the world and see how power structures work for, against them, where they exist inside those power structures, where they might want to exist in those structures. And I think the vampire stories really gave all of these authors started analyzing those things very naturally, very seamlessly. And that was really exciting to see that the conversation, while certainly unified around the vampire, was also coalescing around these common themes and things that like, as Laura said, we are all in 2018 and through today still really engaged in these conversations about power and culture and who has access and who doesn't have access and where consent lies in a number of like all the various like nexes of consent in our society are really under fire and being analyzed right now. And I think the cool thing about literature is that you can do it in a kind of a fun way. You can do it with vampires. So that is always the exciting thing about pulling an anthology together, is seeing those themes. Sorry, Zoraida, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that I did think we did have like one big surprise, which is the idea that a lot of the stories that we were getting back, the main characters were not the vampire. Like it was the interaction with the vampire. And I wonder if, and so we were just wondering why that ended up being the case. Because so many of us, do we dream about interacting, like having that close encounter with the dark, or do we want to be like the dark? That was a lot of fun.
Become the dark. I mean, there were a couple of stories that are all about becoming that or taking it on. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that, Zoraida, but that was really cool to see how the stories broke down in that way too.
I really like the reflection at the end, because I feel like I love reading short stories, but definitely one of my tendencies is to like, because you can read them quickly, like I read and keep going. And it's like hard for me because I'm so, especially like this one, like I'm so excited. I want to see how vampires reimagined in the next one, that I wanted to breeze through them. And so it was nice to have like that forced pause that like it's just one page, but it gave me enough of a break to be like, okay, what did that story mean to me? And like, how does it reflect, or how should I be reflecting on that? And so I think that was an ingenious thing, and I really appreciated that. Mark, this is such a small thing, but I just like have to ask you, one of my favorite surprises when I was reading yours was there's moments with a screen name, I guess I would call it. One kisses like Gaston.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? What inspired? Like, it was such a fun thing. It's a small thing, but
I had this idea because as soon as I realized like this story that I'd written years ago needed vampires, I immediately was like, oh, I want to write, because I had never written an epistolary story and I really wanted to write one. I was like, oh, let's make this modern. Let's make it someone writing a blog that very much looks like Tumblr. Well, if it's Tumblr, it's got to have notes and it's got to have random commenters. There are actually like 20 inside jokes in all of those names. Some of the names reference songs, some of them reference my friends. Like, I had a lot of fun coming up with the names of the different commenters. And I just wanted to add that extra little bit. If this is a story about reflection, then what happens when people witness you and get to experience someone getting to see themselves for the first time, and how do they react positively? And in this case, with some of these commenters, how do they react negatively?
One thing that vampires meant to me this time when I was reading this, that I wanted to hear your all thoughts on, is that, and I felt like every vampire in the story, or at least in many of them, you know, there was mentions briefly even of like different rules and how they've evolved because they've been around. Like, often many of them were not new vampires, some of them were, and even if they were learning like the set of rules that vampires have come to over the course of the years. Like, I think Natalie and Credit and yours, they can't hunt in Central Park anymore, right? Am I getting right? Remember that correctly? You know, because there's just too much attention there, and so there's just rules and boundaries and etc. But within that, I started to think about how these vampires, to me, now feel like their way of thinking of future generations and getting out of like my immediate mindset, because they all represent like how they're thinking and caring for the earth or people over the longer period of time. And so that was just my own evolution of what vampires have meant to me. But I was wondering anyone else's, and I think we've spoken to that a little bit here, of like when you sat down to write it, like what did you think of vampires? But what does that all mean for you, and how has that changed and evolved from first hearing them?
I studied Gothic literature in school, so my exposure to vampires is very Western traditional, and you know, going back to Polidori or Dracula for sure. Any of the old Gothic tales that have vampires, I've probably read it. And I haven't read as many contemporary vampires. Well, I mean, I've certainly been exposed. I've read Twilight for sure, some of the Anita Blake books. And through this process, we actually ended up reading more vampire literature for the podcast that we put together to run up to the release of the anthology. So now I've read a lot of vampire fiction. And I think, though, that when we sat down to conceptualize our story, I was, again, really obsessed with the notion of power and who has it. So Zoraida and I co-authored the story. I wrote the vampire point of view and she wrote the human point of view. And so my vampire comes from the old tradition of someone decides it's time for you to be a vampire and they don't really ask your consent, and they just turn you. So her origin story is one of violence and certainly not of any choice. And then, but over her evolution, she rose to power and had to decide how she was going to do that. And she did that by making other vampires more like herself, which meant that she created this little hegemonic cluster of white lady vampires, right? So they're recreating different problems. And it's a short story, so like, there's no deep dive into this, but it's certainly there in the context. But I was really concerned with the notion of, once you have been brought into a violent tradition and you have recognized the kind of devastation that it wreaks not only on yourself, but on the world and on others, how do you continue to move forward if the rules that you've been introduced to are this set system of power, this set way of being, that you, in order to become a vampire, you must remove someone's ability to choose. And that is sort of then your operating procedure moving forward, is to remove other people's chance to choose. How do you change that going forward? What does it look like? And how do you then, because certainly vampires have some sort of community, and how do you then stand up to the power structures in your own community, and do you work to change those or not? What do you have to risk when you're an immortal being? So these are some of the big questions that I wanted to tackle.
I do think that our short story tries to, like, we ask the questions like, okay, here's the cycle, how do you break this cycle, right? And my main character Theo, she's human for the duration of the story, and definitely, like, we wanted to explore, we basically wanted to write like a buddy cop with two girls, right? Like, how does it work when you have like two vampire girls? But it's the precursor, and asking all of those big questions, right? Like, what does the society look like? And I feel like, to me, my vampire origin was the 90s YA novels, right? Amelia Atwater Rhodes, Annette Curtis Claus, Vivian Van Velde, right? So like all of these authors that were writing in like 1992 to 1999, all of these vampire stories that today would be considered short stories or novellas, because they were so short. And all of those stories, we saw this pattern of, many of them were romances, but others were not, right? Like the one about Amelia Atwater Rhodes, In the Forest of the Night, that book was about vengeance, like vengeance on the person who turned you, because it was a violent act. And so it's just, it's there. Yeah, there goes Den of Shadows, the quartet. And those are some of the first vampire stories I watched, other than Buffy. And like, to me, it's just been such a joy seeing people take these old stories and sort of transform them. Or I'm like, even Victoria Schwab's first kill, and that's getting turned into a Netflix show it's already in casting. And it, her story is a queer Buffy and Angel sort of setup with a slayer and a vampire, but Victoria has to think about, or thought about, like, what are the power dynamics here, right? And with both girls having an immense amount of power. So how does that change the vampire narrative? So it's just so much fun to think about. I actually love that both you and Victoria have vampires that were born vampires, which is something that we don't get to see a lot. And trivia, Fledgling and Twilight came out the same year.
Oh, I didn't know that. I mean, to kind of piggyback on something that Natalie was talking about too, like when I was thinking about my vampire Jude, I was thinking about power structures, and Jude is white, as a white girl, and very specifically a white girl who is not doing anything, who has lots of power, and is like, I'm feeding my bears, and none of this has anything to do with me, and I don't have to do anything. Because I was thinking about, the role of white people, especially white women, who end up, just like handmaidens to the patriarchy, doing whatever weird things they do, to just sort of that just compound the mess that we're in. How do you key into your own power, but not for power's sake, but then to actually use it to improve, and for revenge too. I mean, because my tale is definitely a revenge tale, but but to improve, like, what can you do then to improve life here? Do something, And maybe I was talking to myself, I don't know. So that's part of it too.
Well, and I think that sounds like the big takeaway from this panel. Like if I was to name like one thing, it's like this anthology makes you think about power in a unique way through the lens of our favorites, vampires, but to also think about what does that look like for us to change the power system that we're in, or like act change in the future. And I think that is like the perfect note to end on, of like that's my takeaway. I think that is a common theme, and I hope that if people haven't read the anthology yet, that's also their takeaway as well. So thank you all so much for being a part of this. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. I could keep talking about vampires all day, and it sounds like if people are also wishing that we weren't ending, that they should head over and listen to the Vampires Never Get Old podcast, where they can hear you all talk more in depth about your short story. So I just want to thank you all again for being a part of this conversation and coming for Teen Fest. I also want to make sure that we thank the HEC Media as well as the St. Louis County Library for hosting. And just a reminder that you can order any of the books for any of the panels at thenovelneighbor.com. And if you love this panel, there's more where this came from. This is the only vampire panel, but like we said, this is an 11-day event. So there's all kinds of other panels that you can watch on the library's Facebook or YouTube channel. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.